Hey, Julie.
Hi, Jeremy.
How are you?
I'm pretty good. How about you?
Not too shabby. It's been a busy day, but not too bad.
Just wanted to let you know that we are live on Zoom or live on YouTube right now. Just letting you guys know.
Thank you.
Have to get used to everyone listening in, I guess.
Hi, Jamie.
Hey, everybody. How are you all?
Good.
Good. Jeremy, Julie, I don't know that we've met. I'm Jamie Blakesley. I'm the city attorney.
I have only seen you with a mask on, so it's my first time.
It's good to be off with or not have a mask. Better to be in person, but good to be without a mask.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's 6 o'clock.
I only had to hear that it was 6 o'clock, stated by Stephen Hawking, to know that Sherry was in the meeting.
Hey now. I gotta figure out how to turn that off on my computer.
I think it's great.
As soon as Gary gets in, I think we'll be ready to go. Do we have everybody? Can everybody's sound work?
Working.
Hey, excellent. Kim, you want to hit record and we can get going?
It's done.
Thank you. It's not normal for me as the city manager to be able to welcome everybody to a planning commission meeting, but I'm excited for the opportunity tonight. and appreciate the chance to, in some ways, begin a little bit of a new era here for the Planning Commission and for the city. So the mayor specifically wanted me to welcome Julie and Jeremy as new Planning Commission members. She's excited for you to join the commission. I am too, and I know that others are as well. And we look forward to working alongside you in your service to the community. We will start with a Pledge of Allegiance. I believe Gary is leading us in that, and then we will move on to the next item.
All right, well, if everybody could stand wherever you're at and repeat after me. I pledge allegiance, to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now read the electronic meeting statement. With recent turnover, the South Weber City Planning Commission is without a chairperson, and the Planning Commission will elect a chairperson at its next regularly scheduled meeting. This will occur before the Planning Commission takes action on any matter. In the meantime, I, David Larson, have been asked to organize this meeting. As the de facto chair of this meeting, and in keeping with the protocol the Planning Commission was following prior to the recent changes in membership, I do hereby find and declare as follows. Due to the emergency conditions which currently exist in the state of Utah, and specifically in Davis County and South Weber City, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the recent surge in COVID-19 infections across the state and in Davis County, the holding of public meetings with an anchor location as defined in the Utah Open and Public Meetings Act presents a substantial risk to the health and safety of those who may be present at the anchor location. And the risk to those who may be present at an anchor location can be substantially mitigated by holding public meetings of the Planning Commission pursuant to electronic means that allow for public participation via virtual means. And the city has the means and ability to allow virtual participation in the public meetings in accordance with the Utah Open and Public Meeting Act. Now, therefore, based upon the foregoing, for 30 days from the date of this order, meetings of the South Weber City Council shall be conducted by electronic means without an anchor location. Dated March 10th of 2020. I would like to say that as part, well, once the commission does have a chair selected, the chair will have the opportunity to make the determination about meeting location. We are just carrying on the decision that was made previously until a new chair is selected and can make that determination on their own. With that, we will move to the orientation training item of the agenda. And before we do, I want to let everybody know that as the training begins, I am going to bow out. I have not been feeling well today and need to head back to bed where I have spent most of the rest of the day. But I'm grateful for the chance to be here for a few minutes and welcome you to the Planning Commission and begin this orientation and training meeting. Sherry and Jamie are the two main characters in the training and will provide most of that. I will turn the time over to Jamie, who will begin the training, and I look forward to seeing you again when I'm a little bit more coherent. So,
Get feeling better,
Feeling better,
David.
Dave.
thank you. I appreciate that. I'm sorry I'm not able to stick around and witness the rest of the training. I know it's been prepared and I'm excited for you to go through it. Jamie, it's yours.
Thanks, David. We appreciate you being with us for this little bit of time. Rest up and let's get you on your feet. I thought it would be nice at the beginning of the meeting, where many of us don't know each other, if we did quick introductions. I know the new members of the Planning Commission introduced themselves at a city council meeting, but not everybody was present at that meeting, and it may be nice to get to know each other just a little bit before we jump into the training, and then we'll begin with the materials. I'll go first. I'm Jamie Blakesley. I'm happy to be the city's attorney. I'm with a private law firm, Hayes Godfrey Bell. We're located in Holiday, Utah, and do work up and down the Wasatch Front. I've been with the city since the past summer, so I guess a little bit over 6 months. My practice focuses in local government law and land use and the like, and we've been fortunate or unfortunate, as the case may be, to have a few matters go to the state Supreme Court over the last few years. And so a lot of the things we'll talk about today are not only fresh, but feel a little bit personal. And I look forward to having the conversation and helping you all as a largely new planning commission to stand up on your feet. I am married, have 3 children. Sports are my passion. If it has a ball, I'd like to play it, watch it, coach it. A boy who's 14, and then 2 girls that are 11 and 6. And so when I'm not working, that's I like to be with them and spend my time there. I wonder if maybe we go right or left to right on my screen. I'm seeing Kim next. Kim, would you mind introducing yourself to everybody?
I am Kimberly Gwill, and I am the city's development coordinator. I handle all of the paperwork portion of all the building permits, all the planning, development, stuff like that. So if you've got questions, concerns, throw them my way. My phone and email is always open, and when I'm in the office, the door is always open too. So.
Thanks, Kim. Jeremy Davis is next on my screen.
Hi, everyone. Jeremy Davis. Been in South Weber for a little over 3 years now. Just bought the old Tucker house. So if you guys know where Jan and Rod Tucker used to live, that's where I live now. Let's see. I got a family of 4, and my parents live with me. My wife and I have been married for 21 years this year, so that's pretty exciting. Spent half my life in Florida, Jacksonville for 12 years, Miami for 4 years. And then I also spent about 3 years in Washington State in a little town called Port Angeles. So I've been around and got to experience both coasts. That was pretty nice. Back to my family though. I got, again, 4 kids. My oldest is my only son, Miles. He turned 16 this year. Then I got 3 girls, and we have Callie, Karma, and Avi, and they range from 13 down to Avi turns 8 in June. So I guess that's me.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's great to get to know you a little bit. Gary Boatwright is next on my screen.
I'm Gary Boatwright. My family and I, like Jeremy's, is pretty new to South Weber. We've been here about 2.5 years. In my other life, I'm the operations manager for the historic sites for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and done a little bit of work in history and research and writing a little bit. And just excited to keep continuing this. So thanks.
Thanks, Gary. Taylor Walton.
Yeah, so we've lived in South Weber now for almost, 8 years. Surprisingly, it's been moved rather fast. I can't believe how quickly time passes. But I've got 4 kids, 3 girls, 1 boy, range from the ages of 13 now, and I got a 3-year-old. So I work for the United States Air Force. Recently took a new job where I'm working a large real estate transaction in kind of all over the western half of the United States. And my background is in city planning. I have a degree in city metropolitan planning from the University of Utah. I was born and raised here in Utah. We've bounced around the country a little bit. Most notably, we were up in North Dakota for about 3 years. So that's a little bit about me.
Thanks, Taylor. Next on my screen is Julie.
Oh, Julie Losey. I think Wes might be the only one that has me beat. I've been living in South Weber now for 14, actually almost 15 years, because my daughter just had a birthday. We moved from Colorado to Utah. Before Colorado, we're in California, which is where I was born and raised. I've got 2 girls. My oldest is 18. She's actually attending University of Utah right now. She's in their business scholars program, which really excited for her. She actually went in as a sophomore. She got enough credits done to where she's hopefully only going to be doing 3 years at the U, and I only have to pay 3 years of tuition instead of the 4 years to get her bachelor's degree. And my youngest just turned 15. She's very excited. She wants to get her permit. We're going to have to enact some speed limit signs and safety measures because I'm a little bit nervous about that one. She doesn't focus very well. So that should be fun. I actually come from a family of 7 where I'm the oldest. There's actually 6 girls and 1 boy in my family. They kept trying for another boy and just kept getting girls. So luckily at 7, they finally stopped, but I love large families and, I'm excited to work with all of you guys. And, I actually do think I want to take a vacation though, wherever Kim's screenshot and her background is. I want to go there. So let's make that happen. So look forward to working with you guys.
Thank you, Julie. Wes, you're next on my screen. And
Can't hear you, Wes, even though you're not muted.
Wes, it seems your microphone may not be working. I'm going to jump forward and we'll have Sherry introduce herself and then we'll come back to you.
Hi, I am Sherry Phippen. I've just been with the city about 3 months, but I do have a pretty extensive background in city planning. This is what I do by night. By day, I work for Congressman Moore at his office in Ogden. And I come from a big family as well. There's 9 kids in my family and we have 8 girls and 1 boy. And I grew up moving around the country. My dad was in the Air Force. And then I finally just moved to Davis County a couple months ago. I've been living in Cache Valley for the better part of a decade. And hopefully in the not too near distant future, I'll finish a 2nd bachelor's degree, this time in history. I have a master's in public administration from Idaho State, and that's how I landed in local government. And when I'm not doing one of my 2 jobs, I like to read anything about World War II and baseball.
Thank you. And we'll come back to Wes.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can hear you great.
Okay, good. All right. We came to Utah in 1985 with the Air Force. I retired in '89 after 22 years as a weatherman for the Air Force. I was chief of operations for the weather station when I retired up here. Went to work for Wildlife Resources and state parks doing computer mapping. And with state parks, I was the lands coordinator addressing all land issues and environmental issues at every state park in Utah. That was a fun job. Then I was recruited to a national firm to do consulting for the Forest Service and BLM and the Atomic Energy Commission. And also another company recruited me to do consulting for the Homeland Security with them. And then gave it up everything about 7 years ago and officially retired. I got a wife that I've met in England. We've got 3 adult children. Oldest boy's 43, our second oldest is 44, and our daughter is 37. Oldest boy's got 1 son who's 16, going on 35, I think, trying to. And our daughter's got 2 boys. One is just turned 3 and the other's about to turn 2. So that's where we're at.
Thanks, Wes. I think we got to everybody. It's nice to hear your biographies, even though short. We've got a really fantastic group and I look forward to the time we're going to spend together tonight and at future meetings. I'm going to share my screen and pull up our presentation for the day. And I think my preference with a small group, I know it's a little bit harder in Zoom, but if you, that's the wrong presentation. If anybody has questions while we go through this, please feel free to ask them at any time, and then we can address them at that moment. Give me just one moment to pull up the presentation. I seem to have misplaced it.
Jamie, do you need me to resend it to you?
No, I have it. I just thought I was in the right drive, but I'm not. Give me just one moment. All right, here we are. Thanks for your patience. So we're calling today Planning Commission orientation. There are a few things that we hope to get through. Some are mandatory trainings that you have to have annually under state law. And then the other is, and the bulk of what we wanted to talk about was to provide training on the Utah Land Use Development and Management Act, which is shorthand is LUDMA. And we'll talk a little bit about the powers and duties of the council and the Planning Commission. We'll talk about the things and the ways we need to make decisions to avoid court. And then we will talk about the difference between administrative and legislative decisions and how that impacts your role. Sherry will talk and walk us through the development process and the land use application process and what our involvement will be as a city and as a planning commission in that process. And then at the end of the conversation today, we'll talk a little bit about the Ethics and Open Meetings Act, and then take a little bit of time and just talk about pitfalls and best practices as a planning commission. State law in Utah is such that the state has the land use authority generally, and then the state delegates to its political subdivisions, which are cities, the land use decisions. And so all of the land use decisions made by South Weber City have to comply with state law. And again, the state law on land use, the shorthand is LUDMA. And so we'll refer to that a lot throughout the training. LUDMA authorizes a city fairly broad discretion to adopt its own land use standards, so long as they're consistent with federal and state law. There are three key mandates in LUDMA. One is that a city must have a planning commission, you all. The second is that it must establish land use and appeal authorities within its city. And we'll talk a little bit about what a land use authority is and what an appeal authority is. And then the city must adopt a general plan and adopt a process for considering and deciding land use applications. There are some general themes within LUDMA. In Utah, there's a very strong respect for private property rights. While cities may regulate private property, land use regulations are binding once they're written. And they have to be plainly written to be enforceable. They have to have followed the right process to be enforceable. And there's a rule in Utah state law that if a land use ordinance is not plainly written, then the interpretation skews to the favor of the applicant or the property owner. And so there's often this phrase in Utah that's the tie goes to the applicant or to the property owner. I suppose, Sherry, that can be my baseball reference, but unplanned. There are three primary roles and responsibilities within LUDMA in a city. One is the legislative body. In South Weber, that's the city council. The second is the land use authority. That's a little bit of a mixture between the planning commission and the city council, although it's primarily the planning commission. And then the third is what is called an appeal authority. And the appeal authority in South Weber is a single individual appointed by the mayor to carry out that function. It's an attorney with land use expertise. As the legislative body, the city council is the only body in the city that can enact a land use regulation. They can establish or modify other restrictions or requirements that can include things like uses, density, and other criteria and policy through land use decisions. And then there are requirements about how the city council does those things. They can also enact and designate the uses allowed in each zoning district, land use ordinance that includes conditional uses and provisions for conditional uses. And then they can consider all proposed land use regulations that the Planning Commission recommends. And there's a little bit of an interesting twist with that we'll talk about later. That is, if the Planning Commission recommends a land use change, then the city council must consider that change. It doesn't mean they have to adopt it, but if it is recommended, it has to be considered. Within South Weber, the land use authority includes both the city council and the Planning Commission, and at times staff. There are designations that can be delegated to staff to perform. The land use authority, without talking specifically about the council, Planning Commission, or staff, when the law talks about a land use authority, what it's talking about is the entity that interprets and applies the land use ordinances within a city. And so when you're functioning as a land use authority, you'll be applying the plain language of the land use regulations to a given situation. And then again, if there is not a plain restriction, then the interpretations skew in the direction of the landowner. There are within land use law, and Sherry will talk about this in depth in her presentation, permitted uses and conditional uses. Conditional uses are uses that can apply, and Taylor, I see your hand. Give me just 1 second and then we'll get there. Conditional use is something that is allowed, but only under certain conditions. A conditional use does not mean something is prohibited from occurring within the city. Taylor, did you have a question?
Yeah, sorry to have you go back a little bit, but I was curious to know on your interpretation of land use authority, that's not purely sitting within the the Planning Commission or the City Council, right? It's kind of a blended authority as we've written it into our code. Is that correct?
There are different decisions delegated to different entities within South Weber, each of which are decisions made by a land use authority under under state law. To state it a little bit differently and maybe put a little finer point on it, state law requires that certain decisions be made by a quote land use authority, but it doesn't require a city to have those decisions be at either the council, Planning Commission, or staff level in all circumstances. And so cities can have a little varied mix of how that occurs. In South Weber, there are some conditional use decisions that are reserved to the city council, largely those that relate to commercial properties. And in those instances, the city council's functioning as a land use authority, not as the legislative body within the city.
Okay, that answered my question. Thanks for going back on that one.
You're welcome. Moving forward to the appeal authority, the appeal authority acts as a quasi-judicial body. And so when there is a request for a variance or an appeal from a decision applying the land use ordinances, then the appeal authority will hear and decide those matters. The appeal authority, again, under state law, is not required to be a certain type of entity. In some cities, it's the city council. In South Weber, it's not, it's an individual. If it were the city council, then the appeal authority can't entertain a matter where it first acted as the land use authority. That's not a conflict that comes up in South Weber, but is something to be aware of. And again, it can be an individual or a multi-person board, body, or panel. This matrix I've found helpful in working through the different types of decisions, excuse me, that need to be made within a city. Again, a legislative decision is the promulgation of laws. It's based on weighing policy considerations. It's important to note that a legislative decision is subject to voter referenda. And so the voters or the electorate can substitute themselves for the legislative body. In South Weber, the legislative body is the city council or the general electorate. And examples of the things that the legislative body can do are zoning ordinances, including a site-specific zoning ordinance, the general plan, rezoning of property, and the annexation of property. In the case of zoning ordinances and the general plan and rezones, we'll get into this in later slides, but there's a procedural requirement that they come through the Planning Commission. And in those circumstances, the Planning Commission makes a recommendation to the City Council for how to make that legislative action. The things you can consider when you're making a recommendation on a legislative item are much broader than when you're making a recommendation on an administrative decision. And so to put a little finer point on that, when you're considering a zoning ordinance or a zoning change, you can bring to bear your own experiences and subjective preferences for where you think certain zoning districts should be, what the characteristics of those zoning districts you think should be, things of that sort. When you're making an administrative decision, you're applying the law to a particular circumstance. And so your role is to try to understand that circumstance, understand the law, and verify and recommend based on the proposal's adherence to the law. The decision's bound by the law, and when it's an administrative decision, it can't be based on public opinion or those types of things. This becomes difficult when you have an administrative decision that doesn't have broad public support within a city. Your role is to consider the public comment as it relates to the decision and the facts and the circumstances that you have to understand to make the decision. But unlike a legislative decision or recommendation, you can't make your up or down vote just based on the preference of the community. It has to be applying the law to the particular circumstance and then making a recommendation or a decision along those lines. Again, this is a mixture of the council, the planning commission, and staff. On conditional use applications, residential comes to the planning commission for action. Commercial comes to the planning commission for recommendation and then is reserved to the city council for action. And then you'll see things like site plans, development agreements, and subdivisions come to you for decision. Those decisions are of an administrative nature. And then again, quasi-judicial, these are the matters taken up by the appeal authority or a court. And typically it's a variance and appeal of a decision made by a land use authority or judicial review of the final decision made within a city. That was a lot of material to go through in one slide. Many of you have questions about what I just went over.
So Jamie, I have a question, and maybe it's question / comment. So you talked about laws and legal interpretation. I suspect the city's not expecting all of us to be lawyers as members of the Planning Commission. So that's where we can really rely on you and staff members to help us understand the laws and apply them to the various projects that come before us. Is that correct?
Yes, that's accurate. Sherry and I and David and Kim and the other staff will be available to you to provide guidance and direction. I would encourage you before you come to meetings to review the materials that are prepared. We'll include reference to the relevant portions of city code, especially the zoning districts and the procedural requirements that may come to bear on a decision. And I encourage you to familiarize yourself with those so you can make those decisions. But it'll be our job to guide you and help you stay within bounds, certainly, when you're making those decisions. Sherry has put together a great template for actions that will come before the Planning Commission. And one of the things she's put in that I really love is right up at the top, it says, this is a blank legislative or administrative decision. And that can help set the framework to you of if it's a legislative decision, then you can take into account broad policy considerations that may even include whether it's favored by your neighbors and the public. If you see something and it says this is an administrative decision, then that should be the cue in your mind that this is the type of decision where I need to look at what's in the city code, compare it to what's in front of me factually, and then make a recommendation based on whether I think the facts and the circumstance comport with city code.
Thank you for that clarification. That's helpful.
Hey, Jamie, I had a question about, you were saying with the appeal authority
Yes.
being in South Weber, an individual, are we allowed to know who that appeal authority is, or is it supposed to be kept secret?
No, it's not secret. I forget who what the individual's name is. It's a private attorney.
His name is David Stevenson.
Thank you.
And he's from a law firm. I believe it's in Salt Lake, but it might be Ogden. I'll have to look that information up. But he's the one that does all of our appeals.
Kim, have we had to utilize him very often over the course of, city governing and things of that nature?
No, most of the time we see us using him is when a property owner or developer wants a variance from the city code. And probably since I've been with the city, I started with South Weber City in 2017. I think we've used him 3 or 4 times. So no, it's not a lot.
Thank you.
Jamie, can I add one other thing to that?
Absolutely.
Julie, it's typical for cities to contract with somebody from outside the city, somebody who does not live in this city, because then they're able to look at things more objectively, and they're able to look at the parameters that are set out by state and local law and code when it comes to granting a variance or to making a decision on an appeal. So that I'm aware of, the vast majority of cities intentionally go outside of the city to contract with whomever, whichever individual or groups of individuals they have as their appeal authority, just to maintain a higher level of objectivity.
No, that makes complete sense, and I appreciate the information. One question I do have, Jamie and Sherry, are you guys going to make these, like the slideshow, the presentations available, or are they already available? I didn't see any links in the emails. I just want to know if I've got these for reference in the future.
You will have them, yes. They'll be included in the minutes for this meeting. And if you need a copy for any other purposes, you can either pull them from the minutes or ask me and I'll send you the PowerPoint presentation directly.
Great, thank you.
I think it'll be in the minutes as a PDF just because that's a smaller file to send around.
And they always live on YouTube forever.
That's true. That is true. We'll talk about that when we get to the public meetings. To give a very simple example of how this might function, I'll share an example from another city I represent. There was a taco shop that put in an application and it wanted to repaint the building that it was in a very bright rose color. And it was the only building to be painted that color within the entire city. I mean, it stood out in a really big way. The ordinance had no provision that related to the color of buildings. And the public clamor against the rose-colored taco shop was large. Nobody wanted a building colored like that. They thought it went against the character of the city, was not something that should be approved. And when it came before the Planning Commission, there was public comment along those lines of, we don't want a rose-colored taco shop in the city. The Planning Commission was, in that circumstance, bound by the ordinance that didn't prohibit it, and so it recommended approval of that taco shop despite the public clamor otherwise. And so the shop was opened with that color and with that hue. If the decision had come at an earlier point in time and the question was, do we want to require certain characteristics for the structures within the city, then it would have been appropriate as a legislative action to take all of that into account and decide one way or another whether you should allow structures in that way. I will say in that circumstance, once the taco shop opened and everybody tasted the tacos, nobody cared what color it was.
Jamie, quick question on the recent legislative session. The bill that was proposed on kind of making it the builder's responsibility to decide what he's going to build, and the Planning Commission or the City Council can no longer have any input. What's your opinion on that?
Well, no opinion, I suppose, other than whatever law is enacted will enforce it. I think that law has more effects in jurisdictions outside of South Weber.
Okay.
But certainly is something to be concerned about, and we'll have a subsequent conversation either with the council, probably with the Planning Commission as well, where we'll get into some of the more recent legislative changes and talk through that. There were some significant changes that relate to land use that will have to come before the Planning Commission for action in the next little while, over the next few months. But that's a great question. I'm glad you're attuned to that.
So Jamie, one other question, and you've really said this, I think twice, but I just want to get it out there kind of loud and clear, because the Planning Commission in recent years has taken a lot of heat for recommending something. But it's, again, from what you're saying, we are to look at the code and balance the, look at the proposal in as it aligns or doesn't align with the code. And if it aligns, we are legally bound to recommend approval. Is that what I hear you say? Despite what our personal feelings and the opinions of the city, is that correct?
That is correct. In those circumstances, this can put planning commissions in difficult circumstances. And it's when I don't envy the role of those who have to vote on things, is that once the code is written, if a landowner makes an application under that code, then they have a property right in that zoning for the property. And if an application comes forward that comports with the code as written, even if it's not favored by the public at that time, the Planning Commission's role is to consider public comment in as much as it informs the decision factually, but not to make the decision based on a yay or nay of public support. The decision has to be made by applying the factual circumstances to what's written in the code. And if the application comports with the code, then it really ought to be recommended and move forward as complying with the code.
Okay, thank you.
This is a little slide just on limitations of land use decisions. Only the legislative body can amend the number, shape, boundaries, area, so forth within a zoning district or any other provision of land use regulation. And a legislative body cannot make those kinds of amendments unless it first goes to the Planning Commission for a recommendation. The Planning Commission does not have to recommend favorably for it to be considered by the council, but it has to come before the Planning Commission and have that procedural step before it can move forward. There are two other types of land use decisions that we see. One is an appeal, and that would be if a landowner doesn't agree with the decision of the Planning Commission or the City Council, then it would appeal to the appeal authority. In those circumstances, the review is de novo or on the record, so there are no new facts introduced, but the appeal authority will review what occurred and verify that the land use authority has followed the right procedures and made the decision on the right basis. To be overturned, the decision has to be, quote, illegal or arbitrary and capricious. We'll talk a little bit about what that means. The other type of land use decision is a variance. A variance is a request from a landowner that states that their property is in ways unique from other properties zoned similarly, and that because of its unique characteristics, it should not be subject to the same zoning rules as the other adjacent properties within that district. Judicial review is not available unless the entity seeking judicial review has exhausted all of the administrative remedies available to it. In South Weaver, that means it would have to go through the process and appeal to the appeal authority and get a decision. And a petition for review can come from a land use applicant or an adversely affected party. This means that an adjacent property owner can appeal a decision to zone the adjacent property, even if it doesn't zone their property because of those impacts. The judicial review of a land use decision looks at two different things. It can look at the validity of the ordinance, and that's whether the legislative decision was properly enacted and is valid, or it can look at the application of the ordinance to a particular circumstance. This is the administrative or quasi-judicial decision, and then can look to see whether that decision was made in an arbitrary and capricious or illegal manner. A decision is arbitrary and capricious if it's not supported by substantial evidence in the record of the proceeding. So an example, if you deny an application because you think that it has insufficient parking or insufficient traffic flow, but there's nothing in the record that indicates a parking study was conducted, then your decision would be subject to be questioned under this arbitrary and capricious standard because there's no evidence in the record. But if you suspect that something has insufficient parking and you demand a parking study, and the parking study confirms that, and then you deny the application for having insufficient parking, then that decision will have been based in substantial evidence and would be supported on judicial review. On the validity of the ordinance or on the legislative side, the analysis is simply whether the law is contrary to state or federal law. And the legislative standard there is whether it was reasonably debatable. And again, on an administrative, it's whether there was substantial evidence. On the legislative side, there's pretty broad discretion because those are policy decisions that are based on a number of different policy considerations. And then again, just a note that arbitrary and capricious means is it or is it not supported by substantial evidence, and public clamor is not substantial evidence. That's the end of my portion on land use. Before we jump to Sherry's portion, are there any other questions? Great, seeing none. Sherry, I will tag you and you can talk about the development process.
Thanks, Jamie. So Jamie and I are both big fans of baseball, and we try and throw baseball into a lot of different things that we do with the city. So I am going to start my portion of this with a quote by Babe Ruth. It says, "The way a team plays as a whole determines its success. You may have the greatest bunch of individual stars in the world, but if they don't play together, the club won't be worth a dime." I really like the idea that puts forward, like, as individual members of the Planning Commission, you all have varying ideas, varying skill sets, varying strengths, weaknesses, all of that. And that's good, and that's to be expected. But the real strength in the Planning Commission comes when you guys can take all those individual strengths and things and put it together as one, and make those effective decisions and things that are going to be best for the city. So there's a few different things that I'm going to talk about. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the subdivision process, because that's generally what people think of when they think of the Planning Commission. And after that, then we'll go to some of the other things that the Planning Commission does. Jamie, do you want to go to the next slide for me? So there's a lot of things that'll happen with subdivisions before it comes to the Planning Commission. And these are things that staff works on and works out. You know, because there's a lot of work that goes into it for people before, like I said, before it ever comes to you guys. The first thing that sometimes people will opt to do is what's called a concept plan. And it can be pretty loosey-goosey. It doesn't have to be engineered or drawn to scale necessarily. It's just kind of a basic layout of a project. And what they'll do if they opt to do this, and they don't have to, is they'll bring it to staff and myself and Brandon Jones, that's the city engineer, and Derek Tolman, that's the fire chief, and other city staff. We sit down with the developer and we give them kind of the major red flags. You know, we'll talk to them about things like major roads that they're going to need to plan for and take into account. I'll look at the zoning and look at the density and things like that. And it just it gives them an opportunity to go back and forth with city staff about generally what they want to do. And like I said, it's not required. But it saves them time if they choose to do that. And then the next step, and this is the first step that is required, is they'll do what's called a sketch plan. And a sketch plan is just a higher level of detail for what it is that they want to do. It's when they actually start doing a survey of the property and getting pretty well figured how they're going to lay things out. And that's their first sort of formal pitch to the city. And we look at a lot of similar things once they've actually laid out what they want to do. Again, we look at things like fire code, city engineering, roads, water, sewer, zoning, density, how it complies with the general plan, things like that. So that all happens before it comes to the Planning Commission. Do you want to go to the next slide, Jamie? Thank you. And then they bring in the preliminary plat. And they do a bunch of back and forth again with staff. But once they've worked out all those major things, then it comes to the Planning Commission. And these are things that you guys are going to look at as a commission. You're going to look at, does it satisfy the intent of the general plan? Sometimes there'll need to be we'll talk about rezones in a minute, but frequently a preliminary plat will come along with a rezone application, because maybe right now the property is zoned agriculture, but they want to do a subdivision on it. And so you're going to look at things like, okay, does the general plan project that this property is going to be residential at this level of density? And the general plan is is something that if you guys haven't read yet, I would strongly encourage you to make that, for lack of a better term, make the general plan and Title 10 of the city code, make those your guiding books. Those are going to be what you're going to want to know inside and out. And we're working on updating a lot of Title 10, so that's going to change some. But those are going to be the two main things that you're going to want to know as commissioners. Because those are going to be two of the big things you're going to look at when preliminary plans come to you. Does it satisfy the intent of the general plan, and does it comply with relevant zoning codes and engineering standards? And Jamie briefly referenced this, but when those things come to you, you guys will be presented as a commission with a staff report that has relevant codes and general plan analysis that I'll put together, and other staff may put together as well. And it'll have our analysis of it and whether or not the project specifications meet those things. And our city code right now states that at a preliminary plat, the Planning Commission will hold a public hearing. And this is a little bit of an interesting situation, because by and large, subdivision approvals, once the property has been rezoned, subdivision approvals generally are administrative. And so, to go back to something Jamie said earlier, when a decision is administrative, public clamor, while it can be received and listened to, the goal of the commission, or the job of the commission, is to make the recommendation based on whether or not it complies with code, without giving consideration to whether the public is in favor of it or not. You'll want to listen to it, but the dominant thing there is going to be, does it comply with relevant city code and the general plan? And so as a general rule, the Planning Commission is going to have 3 courses of action. The Planning Commission, because the preliminary plan doesn't go to City Council, the Planning Commission, this is one place where they would approve the preliminary plan, or it could be denied if there are still outstanding issues when it comes to code, general plan, and engineering standards that need fixed, or it could be tabled. But as a general rule, it could be tabled for a time period to give them, and maybe I need to have Jamie clarify this for me. If an action is tabled, will you clarify what happens when someone tables an action?
Typically when an action is tabled, it's taken up again at a later date. Once more information is gathered and can be considered. There may be a little bit of a difference in the commission's obligations if an item is tabled, if it's administrative versus whether it's a legislative decision. Legislative decisions often don't have a timeline. They're not required to be decided or handled within a certain period of time. An administrative decision can be bound by timelines. If the code provides for certain decisions to be made with regard to an application within a certain date, then the Planning Commission would be limited in the amount of time it could table an item before acting.
Thank you. It's not on subdivisions. I don't think it's going to be very often that you're going to table something, because staff does a significant amount of work with the developers prior to a preliminary plan coming to you all. So the majority of what you're going to do is you'll you'll either approve it or you'll deny it until they go back and fix the outstanding problems. But hopefully staff will do enough work with the developer beforehand that even that won't happen too terribly often. Do you want to go to the next? Do you guys have any questions about preliminary? Yeah, Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, I do have a quick question. And so when you looking at your first two bullets there, you know, does the project satisfy the intent of the general plan? And then does it comply with relevant zoning codes? Is the plan code, the general plan code? Or is it really just a plan? Because the general plan's revised every, what, 3 to 4 years, and things change. You know, if somebody comes with a brilliant idea for something that differs from the general plan, how does a situation like that work out?
It can happen a couple different ways. You're not bound to approve something or recommend something if the answer to the first question is maybe not. Because you're right, there are some times when people will come to the city with a project or an idea that the city hasn't considered. And at that point, a couple of different things can happen, because the general plan is not code. The general plan seeks to inform code. It's used as a guide for the city to create code from frequently. But in and of itself, the general plan is not city code. If someone comes with an idea for a land use proposal or a zoning idea or something like that, the city has a couple of different options. You can proceed, because the general plan is not code, it's a guideline. You can proceed with the project as it's presented. Or you can go through the process of amending the general plan to reflect the idea that the person came up with. Different cities handle it differently. But both of those options are available to the city when somebody comes with something that maybe doesn't meet specific parts of the general plan. So you can do a couple different things with it. Does that kind of answer your question? Do I need to go into more detail?
No, that answers it for me. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Does anybody else have questions on preliminary plats, on the preliminary stage of subdivisions before we go on?
Hey, sure. I got a quick question. Just on verbiage to make sure I'm interpreting this correctly. When you say satisfy the intent, I'm assuming intent is used specifically here, or maybe not. Is that where you're saying that we have the ability to interpret the general plan? Because it could be a little vague, so we have the authority to interpret what the intent or the spirit of the general plan was?
Yeah, there are some things, like I said, where the general plan is more guideline and it's not specific city code. There are purposely, and every city does this.
It's 7 o'clock.
There you go. All right, you guys know you've been in here now. You can hear my computer. There are purposely things that are left up to the discretion. It'll give you a broad intent, but then you're given some flexibility to determine what that intent is and to see if that project meets it. Does that answer your question, Jeremy? Okay. Does anybody else?
Hey, Sherry.
Yeah.
I had a question. I'm sorry. So with a preliminary plat, I've always wondered this. Does it convey entitlement at the preliminary stage?
Jamie can correct me if I'm wrong, but a preliminary plat, the rezone conveys certain entitlements to develop the property under the zoning. but the preliminary plat does not, because there are additional requirements that have to be met and additional things that have to be done. The final plat and the recording of the final plat secures entitlements, but not the preliminary. Is that correct, Jamie?
That's right.
Sweet. I love when I answer a question and then Jamie says I'm right. Does that answer your question, Taylor?
It does, yeah.
Okay. And Jamie, do you want to go on to the next one? Now the final plat is generally a smoother process. Preliminary plat's not rough, but it's just a little bit more of an in-depth process because of the public hearing requirement and things like that. The final plat, the Planning Commission looks at it one more time, says, have they met all the conditions and standards of their preliminary approval? This time there's no public hearing. And then this time, rather than approving or denying, the Planning Commission is going to make a recommendation to the City Council on whether or not they think the City Council should approve the subdivision. That one, like I said, it's a little more straightforward. Do you have any questions about final plat approval? Okay. So that's kind of the basics of subdivision process. And then once the council gives final approval to a subdivision, then there's a few things that happen on the developer end of it, like getting signatures and preparing it to be recorded. And what's going to be recorded has to line up with what the final plat looks like. There's not room for them to make adjustments between final plat approval and recording. And then they also provide the city with some things about how they're gonna do the infrastructure. And then we have a meeting with them and then they kind of go from there. And at a certain point, they're able to pull building permits. But that's kind of the Planning Commission's involvement in the subdivision process. So if there's no questions on that, we'll go to the next one, Jamie.
Sherry, actually, I have a question. And it's just going back. So with the final plat and kind of tagging on to the back of Taylor's question about when are the entitlements conveyed, if it is on that final plat stage, at that point, what does that mean? Like, what do those entitlements, that means at this point, there's been, you know, certain decisions, obviously money spent by the developer, you know, things along that lines, but exactly what are those entitlements?
As far as from my understanding, those entitlements, once the final plat is approved and recorded, that's their green light, that's their entitlement to develop the project as they've platted it, to begin selling lots, to begin pulling building permits, and to develop the project as it's recorded. Because the city has to sign off. There's various signatures that the city has to sign to give the developer. And once those signatures are in place, that's when they go and record it. The Planning Commission chair signs it, the city engineer, the mayor. Jamie, as the city attorney, do you sign Mylars?
I do, yes.
Okay. So there's certain signatures like that. And once those signatures are executed, that's when it gets recorded. And that's when they're entitled to develop the property under the conditions that are on the document that they record, that we refer to as the Mylar.
Julie, you ask an important question. There are entitlements that happen broad to narrow, I would say, and at the broadest level, it's the entitlement to the particular zoning applied to a parcel of property. And once somebody makes an application to subdivide or develop a property as it's zoned, then they at that moment have entitled themselves to that particular zoning for the property. They have not yet entitled themselves to the subdivided plats and the rights that Sherry outlined so nicely, like the right to sell the subdivided parcels and the like. But to the zoning, they have at that moment entitled themselves to that zoning. And so if the city were then to reconsider zoning for the district and rezone that property, that particular property owner would have the right to develop under the previous zoning regulations.
Yeah. And that's why, oh, sorry.
There are a few applications still working through the process right now in the city where that is the circumstance. There was a prior mixed use zone that applied to some parcels, and that zone no longer exists within the city code, but because those applications were made under the prior code, that's what the Planning Commission will apply when it considers those applications.
Right.
Is that the property that's located south of South Weaver Drive and also the one that's to the east of 475 East? Those two larger properties?
I believe
so.
It's the Lofts development that I'm referring
to. Julie, I think the ones that you're talking about, it's the Paul property and the Stevens property. So, and those we're just having conversations on. Those don't have formal applications. And there's some things that are unique about those. So those two projects actually have to go to the city council first, just because of the unique nature of the project. But those are almost the only cases where a project has to go to the city council first and then come back to the planning commission. And that's one of the reasons why rezone applications, the council and commission want to look really closely at, because as Jamie said, once a property is zoned a certain thing, there is that broad level entitlement to develop it at whatever the density and things like that are for that particular zone. Wes, did you have a question a minute ago?
The one thing that we've had in the past with the final plat is that a lot of times they'll come in and there's a lot of things that need to be completed before the plat can be approved. Is there any way that we can say, hey, we're not going to approve this final plat until these things are done? Or could we say, we will approve this upon completion of these final upgrades or whatever needs to be done to the plat?
Well, hopefully staff will up their game and make sure that all those things are done before it gets to the commission. You can recommend with conditions, and make it so that there are things that have to be done before it goes to the city council. That's not my favorite way to do things because sometimes those things slip through the cracks. But again, that is possible to make a recommendation with conditions. Or
there
you
can
can
be circumstances where a developer has timelines that don't align with the frequency of the planning commission's meetings.
Yeah.
And so it is allowed in that circumstance for the planning commission to make conditional approvals.
Yeah.
And then have staff verify that those conditions occur.
Yeah.
Before it moves forward, and you will see
that. In the past, we've had a final plat, and then 2 or 3 pages from staff saying, well, this needs to be done, this needs to be done, this needs to be done. I would much rather see all of that completed before that final plat comes to the planning commission.
As would we.
Can I say amen to that as well? Thanks for bringing that up, Wes.
And staff is working towards a better process where that happens. We've had that discussion among staff about, okay, we need to make sure that these things are getting done, because sometimes it gets into the technical stuff the staff is well equipped to deal with, and we need to make sure those things are done so that you guys aren't bearing the burden of the technical review part of it, because that's on staff to do. So are there any other questions about the subdivision process or plats or anything like that? Okay. Another thing that the Planning Commission will do is conditional use permits. And Jamie touched on this a little bit. Conditional uses are allowed, but because of the nature of the use, the city has determined that they want to look at some things a little bit closer. And these are these are typically things that run the risk of having what's referred to in laws and code as detrimental impacts, whether that's related to noise, or it could be related to dust or traffic, things like that. Those are 3 of the big ones. And so what'll happen is both in residential and non-residential zones, there are conditional uses. And so a property owner, a business owner will make an application, and they'll come to the Planning Commission. And the Planning Commission will review potential detrimental impacts and have conversations with the applicant about what's going to be done to mitigate or to offset those potential detrimental impacts. And the Planning Commission can put into place reasonable conditions to offset those impacts. And the key word there is reasonable. And so it's on the city, and this is something that I'm working on reviewing. It's on the city to have a good standard of review for conditional use permits, so that we have a good way to defend any conditions that the commission might feel are prudent to put into place. That's really, really broadly about conditional uses. What questions do you have about that?
Sherry, can I put a little finer point on detrimental impacts? Whenever there's a conditional use in code, like Sherry said, that's an allowed use as long as the Planning Commission and the council review it and then impose whatever conditions might be necessary. But the detrimental impacts and the criteria for those conditions are limited to the categories set forth in the city code. And it's only about a half dozen different things. I think this will be a subject that the Code Update Committee and the City Council will review with Planning Commission input over the next 6 months or so, to make sure that the criteria that are in South Weaver's code are appropriate and complete. There are a few things Sherry mentioned that cannot be considered under South Weaver's code, but are in most cities considered when you're looking at conditional uses. Things like light and noise and dust aren't spelled out in exact language in South Weaver's current code.
Right, and Jamie, what Jamie said is something that I should have referenced before. The Code Committee is currently working on some of those things to bring them into city code where they're not right now, because those are things that are typically problems that we haven't addressed at this point, but we're working on.
I have a quick question. Actually, I had to write it down. But given the process that we just went through with adopting the general plan, and obviously the reworking and the updating of all of our city codes, how closely aligned are we right now with the general plan and our city codes? It's kind of a two-part question, because do we ever think that we'll get away from where a conditional use permit will even be needed? because if our permitted uses in a zone is very clearly specified and it's supported by what we're seeing in the general plan, shouldn't that mean that we don't need to have a conditional use anymore? Because we're telling developers exactly what in that zone will now be allowed and permitted.
I don't foresee the city completely getting away from them, because conditional uses aren't just for developers. They're also sometimes individual homeowners. Like, for example, someone may want to do a daycare in their home. And that's a conditional use. And so you would want to look at something like, okay, you know, how many cars do we anticipate at what time of day? What is their plan for safely getting kids across the street? Things like that. So there are some things that I don't foresee the city really ever getting away from, because, like I said, there are certain occasions where there may be health, safety, and welfare things that you just need to look at a little bit closer to make sure that it's not causing a problem, and to put some reasonable measures in place to ensure that it's not.
And I agree with you, Sherry. I don't think there's any way we can write in code every possible situation that may come up. So
yeah, so I mean, we can definitely do more to tighten up the permitted uses, but I don't foresee the city ever completely getting away from conditional uses. I just don't know that that's reasonable. Not reasonable. I just don't know that that'll ever happen. So.
I know with the new code review and everything, and maybe Taylor, if he's still on, can talk to this, just because he's been part of that committee. Like, are you using the general plan and kind of, because that was a big process, and I know there was a lot of citizen involvement with that, and I'm just wondering if that is being taken into account when we're going through this code rewriting, to kind of look at some of the uses that have been out there sitting in our code, that when you look at that general plan, you realize this isn't something the citizens want. This isn't something that, you know, we really see as a viable, you know, consideration. And so just how close in mind is it being taken up?
Yeah, so Julie, I can speak to that a little bit. It's been an interesting exercise as we look at the zones that we apply on the general plan and what our ordinances allow. We find that some of the uses don't quite match what I think the intent was on the zones applied on the general plan. And we've been juggling, you know, do we want this use here or not? But a tool at our disposal is using conditional uses. And, you know, it's this gray area of saying, well, this use seems to fit in this area. However, we want to ensure that, you know, to protect the integrity of the community or the intent of the general plan, we want to set conditions on that specific use in that zone. Does that kind of answer your question? Or?
Yes, and in case anybody's wondering where this came from, so it's actually from that land use training link that David Larson sent us to kind of scroll through and watch lots of videos. There was a video that was kind of talking about conditional use permits and specifically relating it to, they actually thought they were going away. They thought they were fizzling out, disappearing. And I know it's something that the city has had, you know, experience and exposure to. So that's kind of what was prompting that question.
No, at one point I was totally in agreement with the direction that I was going, that conditional uses shouldn't just be written into the plan, or sorry, the ordinance, because you have to allow them. But in trying to apply some of the uses to different zones, I've since discovered it's really a useful tool to ensure that you're allowing a use, but also protecting the integrity of the community around it. So I understand where the question comes from, and I appreciate you asking it.
Julie, another thing one of the reasons that I don't ever completely see them completely going away, although scaled back maybe the number, one of the reasons is once you allow something, you know, I mean, and you can write certain code requirements, but once you say that something's permitted, you lose a lot of your ability to regulate it if it's not specifically written out in code. And so that's one of the reasons that I think, at least for a while we may move down the road of having fewer conditional uses, I think it's something like Taylor said, that it's a useful tool, because once you say that something is permitted, you lose a little bit of review and regulatory authority. And I don't see that South Weber's at a point where we're ready to be there yet. So
thank you all.
Yeah. Any other questions about conditional uses? Okay. Do you want to go to the next slide, Jamie? Then there are a variety of other land use applications that the Planning Commission will see. And Jamie spoke to some of these a little bit in the chart on legislative versus administrative versus quasi-judicial stuff. But just to briefly review, you know, Julie referenced, and I think everybody is likely well aware of the fact that this city is undergoing a process of revising Title 10, which is our city zoning code. And it's not just the land use matrix of where we're going to allow or not allow things. It covers a variety of things, like it covers all of the zoning, it covers conditional uses, it covers architectural site review, it covers a variety of things. So anytime there's an ordinance regarding the regulation of land use, that's going to come to the Planning Commission for their review and input and recommendation to the City Council. And that's one where land use ordinances are an area where you'll have public hearings and you'll want to gather public input and let that inform some of what the Planning Commission does and what you decide with respect to the land use ordinances. Rezones, like I said, is a big one that you'll want to look really closely at the general plan with, because the general plan has the future land use map that shows what the city, the citizens, Planning Commission, City Council staff, excuse me, what the city anticipates the zoning of that area down the road to be. The same thing with the general plan. The general plan, it's a collaborative effort, but it will come through the Planning Commission. Any update to the general plan, whether it's major or minor, comes through the Planning Commission for review, public hearing, and recommendation to the City Council. And on all of these land use applications, you guys will recommend. It's not an approval, it's not, this one you're not the decision-making body, you're the recommending body. And I know that's just really broad, but do you have any questions about any of that? That's just a variety of other things that you guys will see come through you. Was that my last slide, Jamie, or do I have one more?
That was the last slide.
Okay. Before Jamie tags back in to talk about open and public meetings, do you guys have any other questions about any of what we've gone through to this point?
I talked with Dave the other day and asked him about getting the most current general plan and maps for all of the Planning Commission members. And he said those would be available to us at the city offices if we want one.
Kim, could you take care of getting those together for him?
And they're online too, so you can view them at any point in time. If you want a paper copy, we can definitely print it out for you. Whatever you guys want, just let me know who wants paper, because it's available online. But if you want paper, let me know and I'll print them out, and then you can just pick them up at the city office.
So Kim, I'm a historian and I like books. So
Okay.
I would like a paper copy.
All right.
Thank you.
Gary,
welcome.
I'm jealous. I have to admit, Gary, I'm jealous of your job. That would be a dream job for me.
That's
But I
a
love
fun
what
job.
I do. I love what I do. That shouldn't come out like I'm unhappy with the city.
Kim, I know I'm not on the planning commission, but would you add me to the list to get a printed copy?
Absolutely. I'll print the general plan as well and all the maps associated with it.
Super, thank you. That's very
Thanks,
helpful.
Kim.
To have those.
Yeah, I would like a copy as well, please.
All right.
So if there's not any other questions besides that, I will turn it back over to Jamie.
Okay, thank you, Sherry. I'm going to go through the next little bit at a fairly quick clip. So if there are comments or questions, please feel free to interrupt me. It's required to have training every year about the Open and Public Meetings Act. The basic requirement of the act is that as a public body, the Planning Commission must take its actions openly. And openly means, this is a little bit of a funny language in the law, but it's a meeting is open to the public unless closed. An open meeting and a closed meeting have very precise definitions under the law. And there are limited circumstances under which you may close a meeting to the general public. This is the list generally of the reasons for which a meeting may be closed. There are very few of these that would apply to decisions of the Planning Commission, and maybe the only one would be in the bottom left corner is if there were a matter that involved the purchase, exchange, lease, or sale of real property, where public discussion would be harmful to the city's bargaining position as it related to that property. But I can't think of many more circumstances when the Planning Commission might close its meetings.
Hey, Jamie, real quick.
Please.
Go ahead, Wes.
On the general plan, one of the our sections in there, and one of the maps is our annexation policy. There's nowhere in the general plan that we talk about property disposal. Should we have something in the general plan to address that?
Are you referring, Wes, to properties that would be identified and recommended to the city that it dispose of its ownership?
Yeah.
Yeah, that could, I don't see any reason why that couldn't be part of the general plan.
Just, you know, I think we should have some of the public input as to whether a piece of property should be retained by the city or should it be just up to the city's discretion to dispose of it.
Sure.
Wes, if the city wants to sell property, there is a certain public process that has to be gone through, and they do have to have the public, give the public an opportunity to weigh in. That's not something that the city can just unilaterally decide and then get rid of. They do, I believe that a public hearing is required, but there is a public process to dispose of property.
Yeah, that's accurate, Sherry. I think Wes is talking in more general terms of whether there could be a recommendation by the Planning Commission to consider disposal of certain properties. And then, of course, if the decision is made to consider disposal, then you would trigger the processes you're referring to, which do have some public input and public comment requirements.
Okay, good.
Hey, Jamie, can you give me an example of a procurement decision, just so I make sure I understand that properly?
I don't think this would come before the Planning Commission, but it could, in theory, if you had, let's say you wanted a certain type of study to understand the impacts of a decision. then you could procure services that would provide that study. And under certain circumstances, procurement decisions can be considered in a closed meeting so as to keep confidential the proprietary aspects of what a bidder or an offeror may provide to the city in that process.
Got it. Thank you.
A few notes on open and public meetings. What you say in a public meeting is public. Gary teased that these Zoom meetings are kept on YouTube forever, and so what you say persists, and what can be said under your breath in a meeting can become embarrassing in the wrong context. This is a clip from the Salt Lake Tribune about an inland port meeting where there were 2 members of the inland port board that were whispering as a sort of a sidebar during an open meeting, but they didn't realize the mic was on. And so their entire whispered conversation was captured, and they said things that were perceived to be to the detriment of the public body. Electronic communications along those same lines. The Open and Public Meetings Act, again, requires that an entity make its decisions openly, and texting during a meeting about the topics being considered at the meeting can be construed as not making those decisions openly. Your discussion and your dialogue during a meeting should be made openly. It should be part of the meeting minutes. The public input and other inputs that you receive during a meeting should be done as part of the open meeting. And if you're receiving text messages, whether it be among yourselves, from the general public, from friends, from members of the city council or other public bodies, that type of communication about the matter you're deciding at the meeting would be a violation of the Open and Public Meetings Act and something that should be discouraged. This is an example of texting gone wrong. It's from just a few months ago at a Salt Lake City School Board meeting. There were discussions about school closures, mask mandates, and other COVID-related things. And it turns out that members of the school board were texting each other while that decision was being made. There was a concerned parent who made a records request for those text messages, got them. What I've cut out here is there were expletive-laden text messages among members of the commission that culminated in them saying, "I will never trust you again, you're not trustworthy." And again, that became part of the, became known to the public when that records request occurred. They were certainly extra conversations to what was happening during the public meeting, and not something that should happen under the Open and Public Meetings Act.
Jamie, real quick, what if a developer contacts one of the planning commission members outside of a meeting? Is that allowed?
You should decline that contact and that communication and inform them that your communication should occur during the planning commission meeting.
Jamie, one other thing on that, and I've emailed you about this, but social media. If a majority of us are commenting on a post on social media, does that become a public meeting or an open meeting?
It may. It's defined that anytime a quorum of the public body is, quote, gathered, then it could be construed to be a public meeting. That may include a text conversation in a messaging app or in a social media post or elsewhere. And I would just recommend as a matter of practice that if it's a decision that's coming before the Planning Commission, especially if it is an administrative decision coming before the Planning Commission, to have the record of your decision be what occurs at the Planning Commission meeting. That doesn't mean that you can't seek advice and input from city staff if you have questions or information that you need leading up to that meeting, but it means that your deliberation and your dialogue and all of the facts and circumstances that you consider should be made part of the record of that public meeting, and then have that reflect the decision instead of conversations that might occur elsewhere. Moving on, there is the Municipal Officers and Employees Ethics Act that you should be mindful of and aware of. You now are a municipal officer as members of the Planning Commission, and your actions and activities are subject to the restrictions of the Act. The Act is intended to handle conflicts of interest, and it does so by requiring that those conflicts be disclosed, and that there be no conflicts between your public duties and your personal interests. I will say Utah's law is more liberal than that of most states. It doesn't in all circumstances require recusal if there's a conflict, but it does require disclosure. And there are specific requirements about the timing of that disclosure that we'll talk about. You're prohibited from doing these 6 things. You cannot use your public office for personal benefit. You cannot receive compensation for helping somebody with a transaction involving the city. You cannot have an interest in a business regulated by the city. You cannot have an interest in a business doing business with the city. And then any conflict of interest, again, involving your official duties, needs to be disclosed. And inducing another officer or employee to violate the Act is itself a violation of the Act. And we'll provide some examples and talk through what some of these things mean. Not using public office for personal benefit. You may, in carrying out your duties, receive private, controlled, or protected information. And if you use that information to further your own economic interests or to secure any specific privileges for yourself, that can be a violation of the Act. Here is a headline that occurred with the Utah Transit Authority, where you had a developer who was also a member of the UTA board and allegedly earned income by purchasing and selling and developing property near the future location of front-runner stations before the public was aware of where those stations and where those locations might be. Gifts are prohibited under the Act, but there are exceptions. If it's a non-pecuniary gift of less than $50, for example, a meal or something like that, that can be accepted, but cash could never be accepted, and no gift over $50 can ever be accepted. Compensation for a transaction involving the city without disclosure is prohibited. Similarly, an interest in a business regulated by the city, an interest in a business doing business with the city, and any personal interest or investment. I always think in my head of the headline rule, and it's how would my behavior read if it were the headline on the front page of the paper or the front page of an article online. And sometimes even if you comply with the requirements of the Public Officers and Employees Ethics Act or the Municipal Officers and Employees Ethics Act, the perception of the behavior can still become a headline. And here we have an example where now the governor, the former lieutenant governor, and a justice of the state Supreme Court were on video seated courtside at a Utah Jazz game. They had purchased the tickets themselves, but paid for the tickets after the fact. And the perception of them being in that location was that they accepted a gift over $50, even though in fact it appears as if they paid for that themselves. Those are just a couple of highlights from the Ethics Act. If you'd like to look at a little bit more robust conversation on the topic, there's a presentation I gave at the City Council retreat just a few months ago that will go into more detail and more in depth on the other aspects of the Act. Any questions about that before we move on? Okay. I wanted to jump to just two slides about pitfalls and best practices, and then that will conclude our orientation. And I just want to go through these point by point because I think they're important for you to consider. When you make a decision as a member of the Planning Commission, your first question ought to be, is this an administrative, a legislative, or a quasi-judicial action? In your case, it will either be administrative or legislative. And of course, the significance is if it's an administrative action, then your role is to understand the facts and then apply the facts to what's in code and then make a decision or a recommendation on that basis. If it's a legislative decision, then you can bring to bear and bring into account all of the competing policy considerations that may be important to you, including your own preferences or the preferences for the public. Whereas with an administrative decision, your preferences or public opinion are not factors that you can consider when making those decisions or those choices. Again, know your role and know your responsibility. When there are procedural requirements, follow them exactly. If a person doesn't like the decision of a planning commission or a city council, they will often look to see whether the council or the commission followed the proper process. If you follow the proper process and happen to make an unpopular decision, either with the developer or with the public, you're protected if you have followed the right procedures. Document the decision of the Planning Commission in writing. The commission recently had to consider an amendment to a conditional use permit where the first two iterations of that conditional use permit were enacted by motion during meetings years ago, and they had to be pieced together to understand exactly what they were. Please make your decisions in writing and demand, if they're not in writing, that staff put them in writing when you do so. State the reasons for your choices so they can be understood. For legislative decisions, you should consider public hearings an opportunity to learn about the issue and inform your opinions. For administrative decisions, public opinion is something that may provide factual information to you, but again, your job is to know the law and then apply it exactly to the circumstance. Whenever reasonable, you may delegate to those that are employed to help you in your work. But if you are delegating authority, please give clear directions and be clear about what you are delegating. And then the final bullet on this page is if there are any actual or potential conflicts of interest, please feel free to call me and I can guide you through that process. But be mindful that you must recuse yourself before a decision is made. Recusal after the fact is insufficient and could expose you to prosecution under the Act. A few phrases and other things that are pitfalls and mistakes would be site visits. As Gary mentioned, if a developer were to phone you and to ask whether you could speak about a matter, please decline and defer that conversation to the public meeting. Any statement on an administrative decision that says, I understand that's what the ordinance requires, but I really prefer, would be inappropriate. Again, I understand it satisfies the ordinance, but nobody in the neighborhood likes it. Any text messaging or text communication during a meeting about the topic being handled at the meeting. Any pre-meeting commitments, any business dealings with an applicant, or any undisclosed interest in a project can be something that can be problematic both for the decision and your particular role in the decision. Sherry, anything to add before we conclude the presentation?
I don't think so. You know, I mean, I hope you guys know that Jamie and I are both always here to answer questions. You know, there's nothing that you guys can bring to us if you have a question about procedure or projects or, you know, past history on a property. If I can't answer it, then I'll either refer you to Kim or Jamie. because I am still getting a little bit up to speed on the goings on at the city and on the history of certain projects. But honestly, there's nothing you guys can bring to us when it comes to how you're supposed to do things or what's going on with certain projects.
So Jamie, can I ask one question about your last slide?
Absolutely.
Specifically the phrase, that's outside of our scope. The past year sitting on the Planning Commission, we tend to get into a lot of discussions, and the discussions sometimes do expand, at least from what I have felt, are really beyond the question at hand. So what do you mean by that phrase, and how is that a pitfall?
It's precisely what you're talking about here, that often Planning Commission discussions can delve into personal preferences or things that are beyond the scope of the decision that you need to make. And it often can be a challenge to bring the conversation back to the things that are relevant for a Planning Commission to consider.
One thing that one time I frequently have seen that happen is when a subdivision comes forward and it's laid out a certain way, and the individual commissioners don't like how it's laid out, so they maybe will try and say, well, have you thought about doing the roads this way? Or have you thought about making the lots face this way instead? That's one that I see happen frequently. And that would just be an example of something that's outside your scope. If you just wanted a specific example of one thing.
Oh, go ahead, Taylor.
I was just going to mention that's really hard, because sometimes there is a blended line between how a lot lays out and how the traffic flow is in the subdivision, to carry your example forward. Like we are within scope when we start talking about transportation networks and roadways, right? So those are always hard conversations to pinpoint when they go outside of the scope.
Right.
And, on another standing too, I wanted to bring this up as something, as a member of the city council brought it up to me, but if there are portions of the code that aren't, how's it termed to me, that are conflicting or cumbersome or just aren't working, we have to provide a recommendation to the city council to look into, changing that code, or make a recommendation to the council that things are not working the way we thought they should, right? That's within scope, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, that's a great comment. I think it is. Certainly the decisions of a planning commission, even administrative decisions, are not binary. And you all are not computers where we just have inputs, process it, and it comes out. There is an art to understanding the impacts of a particular decision, and you have a unique role in gathering the facts and applying them through the lens and through your understanding to the circumstances at hand. I suppose in my mind, I always think of it as surfing. And when you're in deep water, you'll have when you're surfing, you'll have a tether that connects the surfboard to your ankle, so that if you're off the board, you can always recover and find it. When you're in particular water that is strong or deep or otherwise dangerous, many surfers will attach two tethers to their ankle and to the surfboard. That way, if one comes off, the other is still there. I sometimes view my role and Sherry's role as to be those tethers for you all as you're surfing. And it's your role to be in the water and to make the decisions that you find to be appropriate within the authority given to you. And it's our role to sometimes help you find the board again. if those conversations become difficult or you need guidance or direction in how to apply things. But it's not our role to do the surfing for you.
Which is a good thing because I can't swim.
I'm just impressed about a surfing metaphor. That it's almost like you had that ready to go.
You know, you all have really difficult jobs as a planning commission, and Sherry and I talk often about how much we appreciate that and value that in the city. And you're the ones that have to confront the reaction to the decisions that you might make. We want to help you feel confident in the decisions you make, that they're supportable, defensible, and done within bounds. But we also want to respect your role and that it's your decision to make and not ours. And so when we provide guidelines or parameters or suggestions, please take them as that and understand that we respect that the decision is yours to make, and that we can't and won't substitute ourselves for you as you make those choices.
So Jamie and Sherry, I just want to thank you for this. This has been very, very helpful, even having been on the commission for a year and a previous planning commission in another city. But I also hope members of the community watch this as well, because you really help kind of clarify what our role as a planning commission is. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding out there as far as our role versus the city council's role. So I hope people watch it and get a clearer perception of really what our role as a commission is. So thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
Very good. Very good.
This was a high priority for both Jamie and myself, so I'm glad that it's been helpful.
Very helpful. This means we're all ready to rock and roll, right? Like, ready to go? Bring it on.
Yes, you are. So the next meeting, you'll actually start making decisions. Yeah. The first decision will be who you'd like to have lead your commission. But I'll say for me personally, I really look forward to working with all of you and getting to know you better. It has been a real joy over the last 6 to 8 months to get to know the city of South Weaver a little bit better. And you have great people, a great community, and a really, really beautiful place to live. And we want to help you keep it that way.
Thank you, Jamie and Sherry. We sure appreciate all the time and effort that's gone into preparing these trainings. They've been great.
Yeah.
Good.
And if you guys, if there's other things that come up as we go along and go through meetings, if you want to say to either me or Jamie, hey, I'm having a little bit of a hard time understanding this. Can we maybe talk about it for 15 minutes at the beginning of the next meeting? Or even if you just want to shoot either one of us an email, we both have excellent resources on a bunch of different land use topics that we can point you guys to. So anytime you feel a need for, whether it's inside a meeting or outside a meeting, just reach out to one or both of us and we'll get you taken care of.
May I ask one more question?
Mm-hmm.
So I know Blair is assigned as the liaison from the city council to the planning commission. Mm-hmm. It seems like during the course of last year, he's really kind of taken a backseat. He used to be a little more vocal and would respond to questions and stuff. What really is his role, and how could and should we use him, or is he there as an observer more? Because I've never had that on my previous role where a council member was there, but I was just wondering if we could get clarification on that.
Jamie, do you want to take that, or do you want me to?
I certainly don't want to speak for the city council or to presume that there's unanimity among members of the city council, but there was conversation among the council when they were considering the structure and the terms for planning commission members. about what might be the best way to have communication among the Planning Commission and the City Council. And I do think there was unanimity among the council that they want a good line of communication, and that flows both directions. But Blair did express a desire that when he's present at Planning Commission meetings, he doesn't want to take away from your ability and your authority to make your own recommendations. And there can be on legislative decisions sometimes a reaction of saying, well, what does the council think about that? And then to either align or move away from whatever that position might be. I would just encourage you that when you have those kinds of decisions, to inform your decision as best you can, and then have it be your decision and articulate it as such. And then encourage all of you to have open channels of communication with the City Council within, of course, the confines of your specific roles. But there does need to be that communication going both ways for the city to operate hand in glove, so to speak.
Jamie, in the past, we've had each planning commissioner would attend city council meetings on a monthly basis. Are we going to go back to that, or is that a thing of the past still?
Wes, did all of you attend city council meetings, or did you have a representative attend?
We got a schedule.
A schedule. This was your month to attend the city council meetings.
Jamie, that's something that's actually going to be addressed in the bylaws that they're going to look at their next meeting, is both of those things.
Perfect.
Gary, to speak to your question, one of the things that's frequently a concern when, and I think Jamie addressed this a little bit, when council members come to planning commission and then report back to the council, one of the unintended consequences of that is that oftentimes planning commissioners will feel pressured to just do the bidding of the city council if there's a council member there, specifically for the purpose of reporting back on what's going on at the planning commission. So some discussion among the council has happened, and I think this is addressed in the bylaws that you'll be looking at next week, is that sort of flips, and that instead of a council member coming to planning commission, and this ties in a little bit with what Wes was asking, and obviously this will be up to you guys to adopt, because the council is very much of the mind that you guys are to adopt your bylaws, not them. So one of the things that's in the draft bylaws is that whoever is elected vice chair of the planning commission will report to the city council on what's going on with planning commission, rather than having a council member come to the planning commission meetings, just so that you guys are able to maintain that higher level of objectivity. And that'll be for your review and decision, because you guys, like I said, you guys will adopt those. But that's the more or less the direction that council gave staff, that they wanted to proceed with how that was handled.
Okay. Thank you. And I just want to make it clear, I'm not criticizing Blair being actually been very helpful.
Yeah.
In some cases. So I was just really, wondering what the relationship is there. So.
Yeah. But yeah, the bylaws will be the two big things. There'll be other agenda items, but the big things that you guys will do at the meeting next week.
It's 8 o'clock.
Sorry about that. Is to elect your chair and vice chair, and then to review and adopt bylaws for the planning commission. So, okay. Yeah.
And you guys will get that packet tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, barring any other questions or comments, and as the only planning commission meeting where I'll ever act as the acting chair for the acting chair, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll second that motion.
I'll second it.
Thanks. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Hi.
Have a good